Hello, heathens! Today we're going to be discussing the real birth story of Jesus. Now, this was a talk that I gave to the Mythicist Milwaukee organization. They had me on to give a virtual talk on this particular subject, and I was able to prepare this presentation pretty quickly. And this really only covers the birth of Jesus, but there's a lot more to the mythicist position than just this one particular presentation. Now, this is only part of the presentation. I highly suggest you following the links down below and watching the full presentation on the Mythicist Milwaukee channel. Don't forget to subscribe to them while you're there, as well as consider joining us in October for a debate between Bart Ehrman and Robert Price. It's going to be an awesome debate. I'm going to be there, and I hope to see you there. Today we're going to be talking about, why Jesus is a myth, the origins of a mythical Christ, basically. When I first started collecting my notes for this particular talk, I bit off more than I could chew, basically, because when I started writing it, I found that I was getting a lot of information on this one particular topic, and there's a lot more to the whole Jesus myth than this one single presentation. So what I did was I refocused my presentation to be just to just focus on the birth of Christ, using both Old Testament prophecies and pre-existing pagan traditions. And what this presentation hopes to do is to relate the Old Testament to what we see in the New Testament concerning Jesus Christ, and then also relate those to pre-existing pagan traditions as a way to show how the Jesus myth could have been completely constructed, just using Old Testament and the pagan beliefs that were around at the time. Yes, sir. Okay, I see, buddy. All right, so to start off here, just kind of like a brief overview, the early first century Christians, they really looked to the Old Testament for a lot of prophecies as far as it concerns with Jesus Christ. From the virgin birth narrative all the way to the miracles that he performed within the New Testament themselves. The first century Christians interpreted these supposed prophecies as a blueprint for this Messiah person, and these prophecies ended up creating these confusing paradoxes and confusing storylines for the actual Christ myth. So Daniel 9:24 through 27 predicts when the Messiah will come, and that's 70 weeks of years. And the gospel writers ended up figuring out that he not only, Matthew at least, was not only interpreting this as the amount of time between this, between the Babylonian exile to Jesus coming, that it wasn't only the time, but the amount of generations. 14 was a significant number to Matthew, and so when he saw this number, he immediately clicked in his head, and he started doing a bunch of funky math in order to get the lineage of Jesus to connect with David. Matthew basically miscounted his generations. He was off by about 4 or so generations when he was counting. And what this ended up resulting in is a different lineage from Luke. As we all know, both Matthew and Luke have different lineages for Jesus Christ. But there's a lot of questions that surround, for one thing, why did they produce different lineages? And then number two, why is it that these lineages connect Jesus to David, but yet he's supposed to be this divine this divine Son of God. He ends up having two fathers, basically. Well, the Jewish community, or the community in general of Jewish Christians and Jews, were split on needing a Davidic Jesus in the early first century. Jewish Christians needed a Davidic line in order to connect it back to David, because that's what was prophesied in the Old Testament. But then Mark actually has Jesus deliberately say that he is not of David. Like I believe the exact line in the Bible is that, why does David call him Lord and all this other Lord stuff? But basically Jesus was saying that, I can't be the son of God, when I'm the son of David, or son of David, and son of God. Anyways, that links back to Psalm 10. Matthew and Luke provided the pagans that were entering into Christianity with their tradition of a divine fatherhood. You see, the thing with the pagans is that they were very used to gods coming down, impregnating mortal women, and having these sort of demigod babies, and this was kind of like a normal thing for religion with them. And the challenge for early first century Christians was for them to work in a way for the pagans to easily transition to Christianity. If they could do that, then they could really make Christianity popular and easy to convert to. Now, the virgin birth, of course, is what Jesus is known for. Justin Martyr actually claimed that the virgin birth was predicted by the prophets. It's based on Isaiah 7:14, but it was taken out of context. In this particular passage, they're talking about a infant or a baby that is going to be born of a young woman. That's the first mistranslation of it. But the actual context of the prophecy concerns the line, not the prophecy, was the Syro-Israelite crisis. Basically, in Isaiah, he was describing when these invaders were going to be out of the land. And he was describing some kind of future state of events, not prophesizing like the actual birth of the Messiah. But the pagan beliefs are the source for the virgin birth. A lot of pagans at the time, would have virgins giving birth to their gods. Why is Jesus a myth? The virgin birth, we have different virgin birth stories. Matthew and Luke have them, but Luke has very telling signs of confusion. Matthew's account resembles that of a lot of other ancient persons. The husband was informed in a dream that his wife was going to be impregnated, and then abstains from sex with the wife. This is similar to Plato. Plato has an origin story that says a god came down, impregnated his mom, told his dad, "Hey, I knocked your girl up," and then he abstains from sex, and Plato was born of a virgin, right? So Luke has an angel informing Mary, but it has this very curious error in it. In the entire passage, when Luke has the angel explaining to Mary that she's going to be having a child, and the child is going to be named Jesus or whatever, at the very end of it, what Mary says is very telling, because she says, "How am I going to be pregnant if I know not a man?" At the time, she was betrothed to Joseph. So, it should have been, common knowledge that, of course, I'm going to get pregnant after I get married. But for some reason, she's very curious about whether or not, or why she's going to be pregnant. And so this whole part was jammed in there in order to emphasize the divine fatherhood of Jesus, in order to emphasize that God impregnated Mary in order to give them Jesus, and therefore Jesus is, God on earth. And this was a later insertion into that particular part of the Bible. Now, as far as the birthplace goes, Bethlehem is where he's supposed to be born, but Micah 5:2 is actually referenced as the prophecy in which tells you that Jesus Christ is going to be born in Bethlehem. Christians reinterpreted this passage to predict the birthplace of Jesus, but like with a lot of interpretations that they did back then, they took it out of context. They didn't, if they could make a prophecy seem like it's about Jesus, then it was definitely about Jesus. John 7:27 catalogs that the Jews didn't know where to expect the Messiah to come from. So, we know that it's the Christians that misinterpreted this and worked it into the Bible, because the Jews at the time didn't know where the Messiah was going to come out of, and that was part of their doctrine. This causes a problem because Jesus actually grew up in Nazareth, which is a totally different nationality from David. So what we have is Matthew and Luke actually, coming to you with these different stories for Jesus's birth. Matthew actually has them living in Bethlehem and giving birth in Bethlehem, and then leaving out to go to Egypt, and then coming back to Nazareth. While Luke actually has them living in Nazareth and then traveling to Bethlehem at the very end of the pregnancy, and then traveling out to Egypt into seclusion. And yeah, that's what I just mentioned is the first bullet there. In the Septuigiant, which was the Old Testament or the Torah back then, if a verse could be interpreted as a prophecy for Jesus, then they definitely made it about Jesus, which caused like the uneasy mixture that we saw with Matthew and Luke. Throughout all of Matthew and Luke, we have these uneasy mixtures of the stories that give different accounts. The Magi were unnecessarily went to Jerusalem. If you don't recall, Matthew chronicling the Magi coming and giving Jesus the various presents. They go to Jerusalem first, and then they go out to Bethlehem. And this was really unnecessary because apparently there was supposed to be a star in the sky to point them directly where it was. So if they had the GPS location of where Jesus was born, why did they have to go and stir up the King Herod, let him know that the king of the Jews was born, and enrage him? The rising star is a complete legend. It originated in the Jewish apocryphal book of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. The Magi were part of Greco-Roman traditions. You see this in various different historical accounts of emperors, rulers. Like Pliny here tells us that Tiridates, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, brought the Magi with him to pay homage to Nero. Dio Cassius describes the manner in which the Magi greet Caesar by kneeling and folding their arms. Suetonius records an astrologer or Magi calling out that a ruler was born, of the world was born. Suetonius records that a completely different astrologer or Magi bowing to Augustus upon entering his home. And these are all things that were done when the Magi approached Jesus in his manger. So all of those traditions, the Magi coming and everything, I mean that was already pre-existing in the culture at the time. Matthew 2:16 through 18 cites a source in Jeremiah as predicting this event. And of course, if it can be predicted as prophesizing Jesus, then it will be. There's basically an outline of how kings of Israel are received by those outside of the faith. Outlined in the Moses tale of Pharaoh in Egypt, the king wants to kill the infant leader. In this case, there's Nimrod, Herod, and then the infant leader, Abraham, Jesus. Parents flee with the infant till the evil king dies. This mirrors the Old Testament, and this mirroring effect is common in the New Testament when it concerns the Old Testament. You especially see this with the miracles that Jesus supposedly performs. You see them taking the events of what happened with the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and pretty much just reversing them and making Jesus do them. They used the miracles that Elijah and Elisha did in order to craft the miracles that Jesus did. Because if they were prophets of God and Jesus is the prophet of God, then he must have done these things. Of course, Moses. Getting back to the topic at hand here, Moses, he flees out of Egypt to Midian, while Jesus he flees to Egypt through Midian. So you can see how this mirroring effect occurs here in his birth story. Hosea 1:11 predicts that Joseph will be called out of Egypt, and it's actually a misinterpreted line in Hosea, like all of these other prophecies, because Christians apparently like to do that back in the first century. Both Moses and Joseph exhibit similar stories. Moses being called to Egypt by the Lord, Joseph being called out of Egypt by the Lord. Matthew has Jesus born in Bethlehem and then moved to Nazareth, and Luke has him living in Nazareth and moving to Bethlehem, like we had mentioned previously. This results in the effect, though, of this is that this results in Luke saying that Jesus was born during the reign of King Herod, but then traveling there for the census. That provides you with about a good 10-year gap of when these things were supposedly happening. So, I mean, unless Mary had a really long pregnancy, I don't think that, his account really holds up. The birthing of a Savior. Isaiah 1:3 in the Septuagint predicts that the Messiah will, one, not be known in Israel and will be born in front of livestock. They interpret this because apparently there was a king that was born, the king of Israel that was born, and the first to see him were oxen and ass, I believe is what it was. Jesus being swallowed at birth is connected to Solomon, and that's sourced in the apocryphal book of Wisdom. 2 Samuel and 2 Kings records the Lord telling David that he took him from the stables of the sheep. So with him coming to Bethlehem, not having a room at the inn, not having to be born in a manger in basically a shed for the livestock. I mean, all of these things were already happening, or quote unquote foretold, in the Septuagint. So they already existed there, and because they existed there, they must have happened when Jesus was born. The December 25th birthday was given to Jesus to coincide with existing religious traditions. Mainly Mithras. Mithras was perceived to be born on December 25th, which also coincides with the solstice, the winter solstice. And this is a time when, of course, the sun, it's the shortest day of the year. And this was celebrated back in ancient past. They saw this as a time of rebirth, and that's what with Mithras being the primary god of the region, that's why he was given the December 25th birthday. The pre-Christian Egyptians celebrated virgin births on the solstice, and the infant was actually the sun. And the Old New Testament takes on a number of sun worship attributes. We see Samson, who's actually just a reimagining of the Shamash of Babylon. In Samson's story, he burns fields. He has 7 locks of hair, and those are meant to represent the rays of the sun. When he loses his hair, he loses his strength, and he's blinded. All of those things are indicative of some kind of sun worship. Elijah, he calls fire from the sky, and he raises up to the sky on a burning chariot, just like Apollo. That's pre-existing Christian or not Christian, but pagan beliefs that were worked into the story in order to make it, a bit more believable for Christians. Enoch, God's walking companion around the earth, and suspiciously has a lifespan of 365 years. Now, early Christians didn't exactly celebrate the exact day Christ was born in the early first century. They knew that he was born of a virgin. They knew, circumstances surrounding his birth and whatnot, or at least they thought they were told. But what they did celebrate was the Epiphany, and this is something that's even taught today with Christians. The Epiphany was celebrated on January 6th, and what the Epiphany was the proposed, actual birth of the Messiah, and that's when he got baptized in the Jordan River. Ironically, it was actually the birthday of another old god of theirs in pagan worship, Aeon, Lord of Infinite Time. And by a different calendar, January 6th was actually the solstice. So these births and whatnot are really meant to coincide with these solstices. That's what ties them with the sun and sun worship. The Epiphany is still a theological stance today. A lot of people don't. A lot of people say that the Lord entered Jesus when he was pulled out of the Jordan River. A lot of people say that he was, divine from birth. But I have heard people argue that he was not considered the Son of God until he was pulled out of the Jordan River in his baptism. The birth of Jesus actually didn't take any kind of importance until about 200 AD. That's when Hippolytus first referenced the nativity occurring on December 25th. Then it wasn't until the late or the early 300s, when the Council of Nicaea was convened, that it became theologically important. Because at the Council of Nicaea, what actually happened was that I can't remember the ruler, Constantine. When Constantine convened it, the whole purpose of the Council of Nicaea was to determine whether or not the Gospels and all the Christian teachings were God-breathed, and if Jesus was indeed the Son of God, or if it was not God-breathed and just written down by his most esteemed prophets or esteemed people in the religion, and effectively not making Jesus like the direct Son of God. And of course, Constantine, he had a preference, and he let his preference, of course, affect the outcome of the council. And what ended up happening was the Bible is God-breathed, as we all know it today, and Jesus is the Son of God, as we all know it today. And so that wasn't until the 300s. So early first century Christians weren't really concerned with Jesus's birth. When all of this went down, when Mark was written, when any of the Gospels were written. That's why we have, like, with the account of Mary seeing the angel, being told that she's going to be giving birth to Jesus. That's why there's that extra bit that's stuck in there. They went back, they edited things in the Bible in order to make it, in order to emphasize things like the divine fatherhood of Jesus. And sorry, but that's all I've got. So here, time for questions or complaints about what I'm saying. Whatever. So I thought that it would be good to kind of go through this first one. Plus, I had someone request that I address it, and so I hope that that particular person is watching. So let's go ahead and see what Frank has to say.
Puzzle pieces from non-Christian facts. Okay.
There are no... Oh, okay. Crap. You already got me at my first argument against your bullshit here. There are no facts! Well, actually, yeah. That actually is it. There are no